everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome. So, I'm Beatrice. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm so excited to be here with you tonight because my passion for video games has brought me here, and together with Adi there, we co-founded TAGAP. So you might be wondering, who are we? Who is TAGAP? Well, association. We are the Transylvanian Association for Gaming and Art Projects. And we are combining three powerful elements. We are combining artistic expression, game creation, and psychological expertise. Why are we doing this? Well, we are doing this because we value creating safe spaces for people to explore their creativity. So I'm so glad that tonight we have a special guest here. We have Craig, and he has some very interesting insights to share with us all. So let's give Craig a warm welcome and...
Cheeseburger! Yeah, that's right. All right. Hi! So for those of you who don't know me, and I'm going to be giving a presentation today on combat and level design for procedurally generated worlds, which is a topic I'm sure all of you are dying to learn about. So, before we get into that, a quick who am I for those who have never met me before. I got my start in level design making Team Fortress 2 maps for myself and a few friends. I ran live streams and commentated events for fighting games in the Seattle area in the United States, before working for Angry Mob Games as a community manager for their fighting game Brawlout. I made a couple of balance patches for that, and then I was the combat and level designer on Trinity Fusion, which launched in December of 2023, and since then it has been ported to the Nintendo Switch and has received 2 major content updates. So, let's talk about Trinity Fusion. In Trinity Fusion, levels are seamlessly constructed out of a ton of smaller handmade rooms, which are then put together by our level generator in one larger level that the player has to explore and find through. Enemies are pseudo-randomly distributed throughout the level through level generation. So that even if the player travels through it multiple times, we're going to see a slightly different arrangement of enemies each run. That's kind of nice as a high-level overview of it, but how do you make that good? So in other roguelike games, like Hades, the enemies you fight and the arenas that you fight them in are not random at all. They are all handcrafted to be worked well together. Even though the sequence of rooms that you enter are randomly generated, each fight is tailor-made so that they play out in a specific way and paced so that the biomes don't tire you out before the end of it. How do you maintain good combat pacing across an entire 2D level when you don't know what the final layout's going to be? How do you even design a procedurally generated level? Well, Trinity Fusion's design is almost entirely in service of the combat, so before we get into how we make a level, let's take a look at what the player's going to be doing for about 80% of it. So Trinity Fusion's base combat is fluid, in an actual flowing kind of way. Combos smooth. Sure? Combo attacks smoothly flow from one strike to the next, interrupted only by dodges and jumps. Enemies are usually tuned to be able to take a few hits before the player gets an opportunity to land their combo attacks on them before they die. And all of this leads to a sort of dance between you and the enemies, right? As long as you are responding to your partner's movements, those sort of attacks, those red flashes, you are in control of the flow. A single enemy unit is not a threat to the player. The player is more agile, attacks faster, and assuming they haven't become under-leveled, much stronger than any single enemy. We even have a poise break. If that fills up, the enemy gets staggered, and the player gets more damage on the opponent. We do that because we don't want to have the player spend too much time fighting one enemy, even if they're too under-leveled to do a lot of damage at one go. So, how do we prevent this from becoming a boring button masher? How do we force our player to push more buttons and force them to engage with more of our mechanics while still leaving them enough room to express themselves, to play the game the way that they want to play? And most of the time, we do that with our enemies, and a concept that if you've studied game design, you've probably heard before, called orthogonal unit differentiation, which, despite the scary sounding name, is super easy to explain. So, let's get into that. The classic example is chess, where each piece has different methods for moving about the board, and they have different threat ranges. The overlap in attack ranges and unique movements of each piece gives them different utilities and relative values to each other. Compare that to a game like checkers. And you see straight away the massive difference in the number of possibilities for each move. The player has a lot less to mentally juggle in how the fight is supposed to play out. Like, the chess movement and the chess pieces are not complexity for complexity's sake. It's to make the most optimal move in every single situation much more difficult for the player to determine. Because at the end of the day, as a combat designer, what you're really up against is the player's ability to optimize, the player's ability to solve your combat situation. The player will almost always take the easiest or shortest route to victory they can find when up against a challenge for the very first time. And you can totally allow a player to feel like they've solved combat. That's totally fine. We added power-ups to video games for a reason. Right? Power trip is fun, but it needs to be purposeful, intentional, temporary. If the player can beat nearly every encounter with the same strategy or sequence of inputs, they're going to get very, very bored very quickly. So let's talk about how we solve this problem in Trinity Fusion. So this is a pretty common enemy formation you'll find throughout the game. You've got two melee units with vastly different health values, physical size, and attack ranges. One will charge the player and perform a heavy melee strike that does a decent amount of damage, and the other really doesn't have much health at all, although it will leave the player from a distance, with a different attack cadence. But these are both fodder class melee enemies. If the player is aggressive, it really doesn't matter. If they just keep attacking, they're going to get the stagger, they're going to win the fight. They don't need to do anything other than press the attack button. So how do we deal with that? This is only part of the formation. Above, we include this guy. His name is the Switch Room, and he has a rather unique ranged attack that allows him to attack the player as long as he's on screen from anywhere. He puts a little circle on the ground. A few moments later, some spikes pop up. If the player only focuses on the melee units, they're going to get hit by this attack. The squid's purpose in this encounter is to prod at the player from a completely different angle, forcing them to stop attacking and instead choose a different option. Another example comes from this enemy, the Igor Phalanx. He appears quite often throughout the game's ranged levels. The game is split up between 3 different universes. You have a ranged class, a caster class, and a melee class. The enemy has 2 main attacks. It can charge the player from a distance or slowly walk up to the player while holding up their shield and perform a melee attack. The shield makes head-on ranged attacks worthless and forces the player to either wait for an opening or and that's capable of hitting them from behind. And that's all neat. But what makes this character actually interesting is that he has one additional behavior that only triggers when he's within range of another ranged unit. He's constantly checking to see if he is between the player and another ranged unit, and if he is, he deploys his shield to defend that unit, making it a little bit more difficult to kill and forcing the player's attention to split. The Bombardier in this situation can be annoying, but he's actually not that dangerous. There's no immediate threat to the player, it's a delayed threat, so the player might actually just choose to ignore this enemy until later. He might go ahead and find some of the other melee units that are around instead of going for the Bombardier immediately. A sniper, on the other hand, can be an absolutely lethal threat, and the player might want to get around the ship enemy immediately to deal with it. The whole point of these groups is to make the calculus of what is my most immediate very difficult for the player to figure out, or at least not obvious the first time that they see it. So, when placed by the generator, enemies are not placed individually. They are placed as distinct groups of units. This system provides greater control over enemy encounters and combat pacing than a purely random approach. And this is kind of what it looks like in the interior. We'll zoom in on it in a little bit. But within the level itself, on the left-hand side, you can kind of barely make out these red squares with the yellow lines on top. These are the enemy regions. These are regions in the level that I have flagged specifically as appropriate for combat. This is the only place that the level generator is going to actually place our enemies. And zooming in on the right window, we can specify different formations of enemies. So in this, I've marked which enemies are going to be fighting the role. We have flying, melee, and ranged in this example. The reason we do this is because I can set these enemy regions to include or exclude any class of enemy that will not be fun to fight in those regions. Then these groups are placed into groups with weights that they're given to determine how often they should appear relative to each other within the level. Optionally, more rarely, I can specify the exact number of them to be placed if I want to do something special, but only like once or twice. Enemies themselves contain data to tell the generator how they're suitable to be placed. If we zoom in on the bottom, you can see the spawn info where I can tell it, hey, this unit needs 8 tiles wide in order to be placed. It needs to be 7 tiles of space up above it in order to be placed. So that the level generator, once again, just doesn't place a unit where it's not going to be useful or not able to fight. So this... Yeah, I'm not sure what's up with that. Sure, this system, this system of weights adds a huge amount of flexibility. At runtime, the generator checks which areas are flagged appropriate for combat, evaluates the size and heights of each of the areas, and then attempts to distribute the enemy groups that fit in those locations. The enemies that we're actually seeing in this example aren't even from this part of the game, but because I set up their rules for placement ahead of time, using a generic template meant for a completely different level, it just kind of works. This is actually how the game's endless mode works, where enemies from anywhere in the game can appear anywhere else in the game. All of these rules are already set up. I can just literally throw an enemy setup from one level into another, and it will just work. The only exception to this are the arena rooms, which are completely handcrafted, made out of waves of enemies that give us opportunity to break the usual rules of combat, or something fun and gimmicky like drop 5,000 little guys from the ceiling. So then we talked about how the enemies are supposed to work. Let's talk about the other half of the equation, which is the actual level design. So when designing a level for Trinity Fusion, I'm trying to do 3 main things in this order. The first is I need to establish important details, like the average distance between platforms, the relative heights to one another, how long platforms and hallways need to be in order for the AI units that we intend to be in this level to function, etc. During this phase, I'm not worried about the actual layout of the level yet. I'm gray boxing a handful of pieces, taking the enemies that I know are going to be in that level, and figuring out how to make them more interesting to fight through the layout itself. So during this process, I try to standardize platform sizes, corridor sizes, etc., so the artists can create modular art assets that are going to fit into this level, and we can cut down on basically everybody's workload and get to. So, for example, of how this actually affects combat, the tight hallways in the underground labs biome, which is the second biome the melee character enters, is specifically designed to make this particular formation of enemies, this ogre and the goblin, a little bit more interesting to fight. So the ogre enemy fills up the hallway from top to bottom, making it difficult to move past, and the goblin has a unique attack, where once they get on screen, they perform a little roar animation, where they charge at the player at a speed the player can't outrun at their base movement speed, and does a big leaping uppercut once they close the distance. The tight corners are designed to make inattentive or panicking players attempt to jump over or retreat from the goblin, which will usually get them hit by the uppercut unless they dodge with good timing. They also might accidentally dodge too far forward and directly into the waiting arms of the big tanky guy behind him. There's no more the only way out is through. They are intended to be a difficulty spike that prevents players from rushing too much within a level. because even if the player can just dodge through them, that big shockwave attack might catch the player on the back end. So the second thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that the level's traversal areas feel more distinct from the rest of the game. Step 1 usually creates unique shapes for the combat spaces, but we have to do a little bit more to give the game its own identity. Each level its own identity. What unique mechanics do the player, can I expect the player to have at this point of the game? What traversal tools have they unlocked by this point that we can play with? What side activities can we use as a cooling off period between combat encounters? If the graphics were removed, would the player still understand they're at a new level from that experience alone? So, an example in one of the levels called Resonance Halls, we give the players lots of safe spaces to sort of grapple around and occasionally hit switches. It's not really a puzzle, it's not really a whole lot, but they get to have fun playing with the grapple hook, and it just gives them time to cool off between the big encounters. In the Eber City biome, which is the second level of the Rangers class, or Rangers levels, we use these little cube buildings suspended along walls and bridges in non-combat areas that the player can't see inside until they go in. Sometimes there's an enemy inside, sometimes there's an or treasure chest, sometimes there's actually nothing. In this case, I'm actually reusing a mechanic that is throughout the entire game, where if the player moves into a secret area, the walls disappear, but I'm putting it directly in the view of the player and not actually hiding it at all. So, this small addition helps make this biome feel like a completely different place, even though the combat layouts are just marginally more difficult versions of the previous biome's layouts. They're almost identical. Finally, is pacing. When does this level need to end? Where is the fatigue point? How long does this new set of enemies and gimmicks feel fresh? Where does it need to stop? The last thing I want to do is feel like I'm wasting our players' time or padding things out. When the main challenge of a level has been reached, I want to make sure the player gets to the next challenge, gets to the next level. We do this in Trinity Fusion by making backtracking quick, by placing teleporters at the end of basically every single branch of the level's generation, as well as making sure that the level drops as long as the player hasn't, avoided combat the entire game. Provide the level player with basically a nice little rush of overpoweredness once they've cleared out about 60 or 70% of the enemies. After that point, nothing's a threat to the player in the level, they can just blow through it, and it's nice and fun. So, we've talked about the general philosophy and the goals of design, but this is a procedurally generated game. We still haven't answered. So, things might get a little bit more boring from this point out, but this is actually the question I got at basically every single show that we show the game at. How do you design a procedurally generated level? So let's start with a smallest piece and work our way up. So our smallest piece are rooms. These are the basic building blocks of our level. They can be any size, shape, used for combat, traversal, asset gates, it does not matter, there are no limits. So this is our room editor. We start out with a literal gray box, where we are placing gray boxes. Let's see. The arena is marked with the red, or the area is marked with the red X's. Overlap sections where we tell the generator that this room is allowed to connect to other rooms. If any of these connectors is not used, those red X's will be filled in with collision as if they were the gray boxes. This avoids just holes in the level and the player falling out into the void. On the right, we see our actual enemy regions editor. So those red regions, when I told the generator that combat is allowed, I can specify using those tags I mentioned earlier, which enemy types are allowed to be placed in these locations. I don't want the player to be fighting a flying unit in a tiny corridor. Simultaneously, I don't want to put a tank unit on a tiny ledge. Additionally, I can tell the generator exactly where to put a specific enemy by using the tags you can see at the top of the window there. If I place any of those tiles into the room, the enemy gets placed there, assuming that there is one to be placed. We also use these enemy regions for basic pathfinding. You saw the sniper enemy earlier. Whenever he gets cornered, he teleports away, or at least attempts to. He uses these enemy regions to determine where a safe place to go is, as well as just where is an appropriate place for him. So as mentioned earlier, these rooms have connection points where we tell the generator we're allowed to connect to other rooms. The generator will also try to connect these, or always try to connect these rooms by the direction of that link and the size of that link. So I can actually control the flow of the level by just determining what type of link is next. I would usually have like a little spreadsheet where I would keep track, 7 tile links go to an exterior space, and the generator will always generate in that direction. That kind of thing. You really need to work on your documentation when you're working on something like this, because otherwise it becomes really, really difficult to keep track of, and very difficult to actually like get back into your head if you need to go back and make changes to a level later. So, once I have a few rooms that I like with relatively consistent dimensions for platforms and hallways, I send them over to the artist to create the modular art assets. We can create some rules for graphics placements that allows us to automatically place foreground graphics in locations where there's collision. Now this is super good for grayboxing because we get to our final graphics quicker, and it gives us a better idea of what the actual level is going to look like. And it also allows us to reuse layouts that we liked for other biomes very quickly by just automatically placing the foreground graphics. After that, rooms will receive one final art pass before they're considered finished and locked in, hopefully to never require a single change ever again, because if I do, I get yelled at for messing up their beautiful work and forcing the light maps to be rebuilt again. So, those are our rooms. Next we have the room sets. These are collections containing rooms that have similar functions and shapes. These rooms are then assigned to these nodes, which contain information about the rooms and their room sets and how they're allowed to be connected. In the node data, I can specify what direction, any of the cardinal directions, north, south, east, or west, as well as which other nodes they are allowed to be connected to, so that the generator doesn't put them in places that don't make sense or add to bad pacing. Those nodes then put into what we call our flow graph. Now this is what an actual level in Trinity Fusion looks like to our generator. The purple node on the top left is our root node. This is where the generator will start building the level from. The 3 paths below the root path will be injected into the flow either randomly or to any of the nodes that I specified in that metadata I mentioned earlier. Generally, the majority of the critical paths in the world's main exit will be on this root path though. So this is how we control the pacing of the level while still keeping things fairly randomized. Additionally, a level can have multiple of these graphs. I can create a set of flows that forces a level shapes, and the generator will choose from that list automatically. Additionally, we have different versions of flows based on different story flags. This allows us to insert special rooms with NPCs or other characters for the player to interact with as they're going through the game. We also use this to provide easy versions of the levels until the player reaches their first boss, at which point we flip over to the normal ones to sort of ease them into the game, give them a couple of easy runs before we crank things back into normal difficulty. So we can do some cool tricks with the system too. So these 4 nodes are actually a loop connecting 4 quadrants. The rules for each of these quadrants are specifically designed so that they always seamlessly connect to each other regardless of which one gets used or where. If you make 3 rooms for each quadrant, 12 rooms total, you get 24 possible combinations for just one single chunk of level, and it adds a huge amount of randomness without a ton of work. So this one I put into presentation mainly because it's a prototype that I really liked and it never made the final game. In this level, even though it's incredibly small, the idea was that you had 3 floors, essentially. And in each one of these floors, you have a randomly placed blocker, essentially forcing the player to go up or down a level. The player starts on the surface and is forced into a subterranean level eventually as they move through here. Then a second blocker in the subterranean level forces them once again to choose to either go up or down. This made the critical path to the exit either 6 or 7 rooms, despite the fact that the core of the level is only 9 rooms big. And I mostly showed this off because I'm really fond of the design, and I'm sad that we didn't use it, but there's reasons we didn't use it. It didn't offer the player enough opportunity to explore. There was pretty bad combat pacing, considering the entire thing was one massive combat area. and it became a little bit obvious that fixing that particular issue was going to balloon the size of the level or just take way too much time. And so I took the graphics I already had for it, I took the line cuts I already had for it, and I incorporated it into a more standard level for the game. So a quick recap for how that actually goes together. We make rooms, categorize into room sets, which then plays into our flow graph as nodes, which generates the level based on the parameters of the nodes, and then once the level is generated, we sweep through it, placing the enemies in designated regions based on their relative weights to one another, and the enemy's own placement requirements. And that's it. That is how a level in Trinity Fusion comes together. After that, it's... after that, it's all just play testing and tuning. So, if anyone has any questions, I am... okay.
Well, when you're speaking, I can see a lot of passion for game design, but when was the moment when you decided that you want to be a game designer?
Oh, that's actually super easy to answer. Should I use this?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So that's actually super easy to answer. When I knew I wanted to get into game design. That was at a really early age. I used to be subscribed to a magazine called Nintendo Power. And it was like Nintendo's official magazine, and in the intro to each of these, intro to each issue, they had a questions and answer section, as well as a place where they showed off student projects at a school called Digipen, which even back when I was a kid was a school teaching you how to make games. And each week or each month they would show off a new student project. I was just like, you can go to school for this? Games? And so I immediately downloaded Game Maker, which, if you are not aware, is really, really, really old actually. It's been around. And I started making little platformers for my friends. Any other questions? Oh yeah, what's up?
Hi, everyone. So, within your core enemy types, you had a shield guy, you had a sniper, you had a melee guy.
Yeah.
Did you think about having a healer or a buffer for the enemies?
In our latest DLC, we absolutely did. We basically added an arch file. If he is not dead and he is in the room, he casts these little wiggly lines onto the enemies, and if you kill an enemy while that wiggly line is touching them, they have a 75% chance to resurrect, which is really annoying. So yeah, we absolutely added a healer that just made an arch file.
Awesome.
So in your design, you said have a predefined level design to force your player up and down, and there's also random generated. What would you recommend for game jams, as an example, and for general use? Having random or predefined?
If you're making something for a game jam, you should probably just go predefined, because you have a lot more control over actually making a well-paced level that's fun to play. It takes a lot of trial and error to get that sort of pacing right, and a lot of the time that I spent in Trinity Fusion was just, when I'm making a room, I want to ensure that the level generator places enemies in places where they're going to be interesting to fight, which is somewhat difficult. So for those weighted groups, we could specify whether or not that formation gets placed on a platform throughout the entire room. And some enemies work really well when they're on different platforms than each other. Some enemies don't. And it took a long time to find the right balance of just the enemy formations where they're placed and specifying to the generator, hey, put this guy here, and finding a good balance between making that random and making that predetermined. Whereas if I was just making predetermined levels, I would have been knocking these out way faster.
One question.
Yeah.
So, let's say that you would have the chance to do this again. You won't have. At least not with me. But what would be the one thing that you do differently?
Oh, okay. one thing to do differently, if it was something that I was doing or that I was in charge of, one of the things that I was sort of playing around with as we were working on the game was making it more standard, because this is a 2D sort of like roguelite Metroidvania. I was thinking of something that would be more akin to a standard Metroidvania where your progression is more randomized, but the levels themselves are static. So each challenge is still handcrafted, but the order that you do it in, or like where you need to go, what to do next, where you need to explore next might be different from player to player. One of the things I really enjoy about, especially like modern roguelikes or modern like adventure games, is like people talking about, oh, they're telling their stories. It's just like, what if your story is just a little bit different? What if you experienced the same thing, but you had a different set of tools that the game had given you at that point in the game, and so you approached it entirely differently. I would want to try to experiment with that, but I probably feel like.
Have you used your skills of as a level design something else than
So you're talking about if I've used my skills in level design for other things, and yes and no. At one point in time, I made a card game that I want to go back and revisit one day. That was sort of an asymmetrical information sort of thing, where everyone's building a robot to fight, not fight, but to solve this problem. I'm not going to go into too much. Okay, so I will. It was about the Mars rover landing. It's called 7 Minutes of Hell. And the idea was everyone knew some challenge that their rover was going to have to face, but nobody knew everything. And so each turn you would prepare and you would build a piece of your rover to deal with one particular, challenge you knew or you thought someone else knew that they had. And who actually was prepared for the challenges and who just spent money wasted, who spent money on a rover building for something they didn't need to try to get other people to build it as well, or yeah, it was just an asymmetrical information game where it's just like, hey, how can I either read the other players or get them to waste their resources? And that was fun. Any other questions? We got one in the back.
how much do you make you affect you update? How much do user reviews affect you updating the game?
How much do user reviews affect us from updating the game? Well, I'm no longer employed at Talk Games, so I can't really do that. But pretty much not at all.
That's bold.
I don't know how else to respond to that. Like, if you're talking about changing the games based on user reviews, yeah, we launched in early access, we got a lot of good feedback from that. But those updates were going to come out regardless, so it was more along the lines of what do we focus on, like what are we trying to improve in the next update. Like, it helps, but it wasn't the motivator. Also, we were really good.
So you mentioned a lot that you balance the game through various enemies, right?
Yeah.
And how do you prevent a game from becoming too difficult to play? How do you prevent it from your enemies to be too tough? Because you as a developer, you know how to defeat them, but in the end, when the end user plays your game, they don't have the mechanics that you know, and they might find it too difficult at the beginning. How do you basically balance?
So a lot of that was just playtesting. So when I was in the office, what I would do is the person who shared the office with me was the worst person in the company at playing the game. And so I would constantly be like, hey, can you come over here and check something out real quick? And have them play whatever I was doing. Besides that, we didn't really have a lot of opportunities for playtesting, but we did go to a couple of shows. And so I would basically just watch people play, and I would take notes. I had a little notebook with me, and on one of the machines, specifically this one,
I would just be running OBS. I would record absolutely everything that happened, and I would watch it back later to try to find out where the pain points was, where players got overwhelmed, etc. Because like that is playtesting is how you're going to find that out. Because yeah, when you know the solution, when you made the game, you just know the easiest route to victory already. Watching somebody trying to figure that out is probably the only way you're going to get that information.
The OBS has also the webcam. Just curious.
No, I didn't. This laptop doesn't even have a webcam. I wish, because I know that Valve does that, where they actually like have like heart rate sensors and things on their players. They track everything.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So how do you begin your process? Do you start with designing a level and then figure out what sort of encounters you could add there? Or do you start with enemies, sketches, and their movements? Or do you start with the movements and then figure out what they're gonna look like?
We started out with the enemies. Because again, this was sort of like an action roguelike, so that was going to be the core of the game, the combat, fighting the enemies. So we started with that. And again, like most of the whole design came from how to make that actually is complementary to these enemies. So, for example, when you go through the Rangers levels, there's a lot more verticality, there's a lot more like one-way platforms so the player can pass through it, but they can also just stand on it, and they can also shoot through it. Because these enemies, okay, so the player can engage with things that are at greater angles. The player's going to be moving up and down a little bit more. With the melee classes levels, they're much more open, with the exception of Underground Labs, because the melee class has like a launcher that can launch up smaller units, that can do air combos, things like that. They need a little bit more room to fight. They have bigger enemies to fight generally, because they're supposed to be the warrior. So their levels are a little bit more open. It all comes down to the enemies, just making them more interesting to find through the layout, and then just extending that throughout an entire level with like a little bit of downtime between the major encounters.
Thank you for the questions. If you want to ask Craig more stuff, we can ask him in a more informal way. Just so everybody is less tense right now. Thank you for coming to the presentation, and hope you're going to have a nice time in this meeting. Right. Whatever it is.